Welcome to the only daily podcast focusing on compliance news of the day. Each morning, start your day with a cup of coffee and Tom Fox, the voice of compliance, to hear about 4 of the top compliance, corruption, or leadership stories you will need to start your day. The Daily Compliance News is a production of the Compliance Podcast Network.
First, a word from our sponsor. The Daily Compliance News for August 16, 2022, the All Corruption Edition. Today we finally have 4 stories dealing with corruption. There's no lead story, so I'll begin with a story from the New York Times that Alan Weiselberg, former CFO at the Trump organization, is nearing a plea deal to plead guilty to accounting fraud, tax charges this summer that he was indicted on this summer. If finalized, it would bring prosecutors closure around this case. Next up, the New Arab, a first-time contributor to the Daily Compliance News, reports that students from the United Arab Emirate have been expelled from the Royal Military Academy at Sandhurst over bribery and luxury lifestyle allegations. Basically, these rich Emirati students were trying to bribe instructors so that they wouldn't have to go through the rigors of the Sandhurst training program for military officers. But that's sort of the whole point, to toughen you up if you do have to go into combat and lead men. But these students who were expelled apparently wanted no part of that component of the Sandhurst tradition. Next up, from Aljazeera, former Malaysian Prime Minister Najib Razak starts his final attempt on Monday to set aside his corruption conviction linked to the multi-billion-dollar 1MDB corruption scandal. The country's highest court is scheduled to hear appeal of his convictions on criminal breach of trust, abuse of power, and money laundering over theft of $4.5 billion from 1MDB, the state fund he co-founded as premier in 2009. So 1MDB continues to resonate literally across the globe. And our final story comes to us from Reuters, as the United States has imposed sanctions on 3 sitting Liberian government officials, including the president's chief of staff, for what it says is ongoing involvement in public corruption. So yet another West African country targeted with corruption. The sanctions target include Chief of Staff Nathaniel McGill, Chief of Prosecutors Sama Sirianus Cephas, and Bill Treha, the managing director of the National Port Authority. Brian Nelson, Treasury's Undersecretary for Terrorism and Financial Intelligence, said through their corruption, these officials have undermined democracy in Liberia for their own personal benefit. The Daily Compliance News is a production of the Compliance Podcast Network and a proud member of C-Suite Radio. Thanks so much for listening. I hope you'll join me again tomorrow.
This podcast is a part of the C-Suite Radio Network. For more top business podcasts, visit c-suiteradio.com.